What is up, my friends? Welcome back to another video, and today we are starting a brand new series called Orchestration, a Crash Course. And over the next few weeks, I want to show you kind of an overview of the different instruments of the symphony orchestra. It's going to be fast, it's going to be short, it's going to be sweet. We're not going to go into every single detail, but every one of these videos will give you a slight overview of what the instruments are like and what they can do. And the best thing I can recommend is for you to actually go out and listen to pieces of music containing these instruments so you know exactly what they sound like and how they're applied with other instruments in context as well. So before we really dive into an overview of the orchestra today, I want to give you a free guide called 10 Steps to a Clear Orchestral Sound. And this is really important if you're making like virtual mock-ups, if you're using virtual instruments in a production. There's lots of ways you can use virtual instruments, but I think there are 10 very important concepts that we should know in order to result in a clean type of clear sound that doesn't sound muddy and, overly unbalanced in some ways. So, including tips like balance and mixing and timbre and all those things that we need to know to foundationalize our knowledge before we really go making a mock-up. So it's a totally free guide if you want to download it in the box below. It'll take you straight there. All right, so let's kind of get into the overview of the orchestra. So first of all, let's talk about a little bit of a quick background about the orchestra, right? So it's always contained like a timeless quality. When we hear the orchestra, especially strings, I think we all think of a classic sound, right? The orchestra really existed all the way back to like the Baroque era. So we'll talk about that a little bit too. As you can see, it went back to the Baroque era with like strings, continuo, which is like harpsichord and organ, and also some brass instruments, and then the vocals as well. So the brass instruments weren't as like developed as they are today, but there were still some brass instruments there as well, creating kind of a heroic type of sound in a way. Then in the classical era, the orchestra kind of slowly shaped into what we expect today from the symphony orchestra. So there's a lot of string-based playing. There's also woodwinds in pairs like flute, oboe, clarinet, and bassoon. There's also brass like French horns and trumpets, and also percussion, timpani, snare, and triangle. So you can see that the instruments are now much more akin to what we have today in our orchestras, but not quite as full, as fleshed out as the modern orchestra today. Then in the Romantic era, they took those ensembles and added even more players to the size to enhance the overall texture. So an overall larger size, especially with the strings. In terms of the brass, there's also the trombones and the tuba added, so that brass section was entirely filled out. An entirely more balanced ensemble, and also the percussion was varied but less involved as well, letting the other sections do more of the work. And then there's also the harp that came in as well. And when we think of the harp, we think of like magical feelings, maybe glissandi and transition moments into new sections. That's a very common instrument for the Romantic era, of course. And then in the 20th century, like modern music, all the sections are pretty balanced, the strings are very versatile, and they can perform over long periods of time and do very versatile things, like lots of short articulations, very biting and gritty, and also very fleshed out and sustained and romantic and lush as well. There's also different extended techniques that you can go with, like saltasto, flautando, sol ponticello, like things like that to extend the toolbox even further. So this is just a little bit of an overview of the progression of the orchestra from the Baroque era to the modern era. Now, as an orchestrator, as an arranger, when we're working on mock-ups, what are a couple things we can think about? Number one, I think is the most important, is to treat the orchestra as a color palette. So it's easy to get overwhelmed and think, oh, there's so many instruments, like I don't know how to actually apply each of these instruments into my production. Well, if you think of it from the context of color, like what kind of emotion and texture do I want the piece to have, that makes it a lot easier. So let's say if you think, oh, I want a warm and buttery sound to carry my lead melody. Well, that kind of eliminates a lot of instruments. You're probably going to go with strings, maybe a woodwind, but maybe like brass as well. So like maybe a French horn, or maybe like a solo cello or something, maybe a bassoon. Like these are all instruments that you could describe as warm and rounded and rich in terms of the sound, right? So that brings up the importance of knowing the timbres and the sound of the instruments very intimately. So yeah, asking yourself like what kind of texture will each instrument create? So that comes with listening to a lot of music, like soft and brassy or brittle, maybe like even for a trombone, for example, if they're blowing super hard, you hear that brassy sound. That you could describe that as brittle, maybe. And then warm could be like horns or, flute, maybe sometimes, or bassoon as well, or tuba too. But generally, I would say less is more. So when you add more instruments, it's not always the answer to a better arrangement. Some of the best arrangements actually know when to take away instruments, so there's more contrast. So when the larger instruments or the louder instruments come back in, there's a bit of a discrepancy there. There's more of a contrast, right, from soft to loud, and there's also busy and not busy. You know what I mean? So just knowing the instruments and the sounds. And what the power of taking them away is very important. Now, some instruments are naturally more dynamic than other instruments, right? So you want to treat your mock-up as such. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, trombones, right? They're super loud. They can get super loud, or like French horns can also get very loud. So you don't want like a flute, which is a very quiet instrument, to overpower the trombones and horns if they're playing loudly. That doesn't make any sense. That's not going to happen in the real world, right? So you have to think about it that way as well. So yeah, if they're playing fortissimo, like the brass, let's say the trumpets or the trombones, don't let a flute overpower them. So you just want to keep that in mind. And again, that comes back down to listening to the music, right? So here are a couple tips for actual realism, and then we'll wrap things up. Don't perform your your parts in chordally like a pianist. Don't actually play chords unless you're doing like a sketch and you're trying to just get the harmonic foundation of the piece kind of laid out. I would recommend you playing your lines in one at a time, thinking horizontally and thinking from the perspective of the performer, so you know what they're feeling and their emotion they're going through when they're playing an individual line, rather than playing chordally as a pianist. Also, you should study what the ranges and tendencies are of each instrument so you understand where they excel. Like, where do they sound the best in their range? Where is it easiest for them to play? How much air does it require? Those questions. You can always listen to instruments and also read orchestration books to kind of find out these, delicate details about these instruments. Also, you want to use volume and expression to take advantage of dynamic layers. Volume is usually just the actual volume, like the gain of the patch itself, whereas expression can talk about the dynamic layers of the instrument. So if there's, let's say piano, forte, and fortissimo, you want to use those different layers within a performance to show the different expression, right? Rather than just having it all at one dynamic. That's not very beneficial for your mock-up. Also, musicality comes from dynamics and tempo fluctuation. So there's really two things that create musicality: dynamics, like loud and soft contrast, and also tempo fluctuations, like how slow you go sometimes, how fast you go. So like rubato is what I'm talking about. So when you're performing your lines, I always recommend performing them in live as a pianist. When possible, try to play it in live and then use the mod wheel at the same time to trigger the volume and the expression, so you get a most natural performance. Ultimately, you should also listen critically to your favorite pieces and scores. There's nothing better you can do, honestly. Listen like with a critical ear, and then write down the function of each instrument group. Like the violins, are they carrying the lead melody? Are the violas kind of playing counter melodies to the lead melody, or are they kind of harmonizing the violins one right directly below? Are the brass section performing marcatos? Are they kind of playing chords that accompany the main lead melody, and so on and so forth? So you want to try to use your ear and listen as much as possible. And if you have access to the score, then you can check your observations with the score to see how close you are with that. Something that you can do as well is recreate. So once you have your notes written down, you can try recreating the score in your own DAW, right? So pull up your own virtual instruments, start dragging in instruments and patches, and start kind of figuring out what goes where. The strings are playing this melody here. Okay, so I'll put the violins one here. Maybe I'll layer it with violins two. Maybe the flute is playing a counter melody here. So you want to write down what those notes are and then play that in. It doesn't even have to be a full piece. It could be like 5 minutes or something. It could be like a 30-second piece of or excerpt from a piece of music or something. That can already help you understand the direction of the piece and how it's been arranged in a way that makes it very convincing to the audience and sounds very beautiful. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of just the origins of the orchestra and how we can think about it. And in the next videos, we'll start talking about the individual sections, and I'll tell you how I like to use them in context, and we'll go from there. So I'll see you tomorrow with another video, and cheers, my friend. Bye-bye.